So one of the problems with it is that it can only tell us the volume of drugs that have been used, and not the prevalence of
Right.
drugs. So it'll tell us that a certain number of kilos of drugs have been used in this particular area, but we don't know whether a few people have used a massive amount of drugs
Yeah.
or a load of people have just used a little bit.
Yeah.
We can't tell that from that data, and we have to put it together with the other population data to make more sense of it.
Yeah. And does it, I don't know if anyone's done this, but does it spike around music festivals and events
Yeah,
like that? Yeah.
it's very seasonal. So you can see in summer it's a lot higher than in
Yeah.
winter, and it is affected by things like people congregating to, a lot of the, for example, a lot of the festivals are in regional areas. And so when people come into the regional area to go to the festival and they're there for 3 or 4 days,
Yeah.
that might affect the amount of drugs in the wastewater, for
Yeah.
example. But it doesn't, those people aren't there all the time. They might come from all over Australia. So it
Yeah.
doesn't indicate that that particular area is necessarily.
All right. Welcome everyone to another show of the Real Drug Talk podcast / YouTube channel. Geez, we've actually done a few episodes because we're on the radio and it's all kind of here and there. So I don't even know what episode this is, but we're going to call it 2 to 4. It'll be there somewhere. And I'm excited because today we've got Nicole Lee, and the reason I guess I'm excited is because I think for me anyway, over the past, it's been probably about nearly 5 years since I met you, maybe
Yeah,
a bit
yeah,
less.
we do that.
Yeah, it's been a really cool 5 years meeting Nicole and other researchers and people with incredibly large brains in the alcohol and drugs sector, because I've learnt so much, and I'm kind of excited to bring that onto the show and talk to Nicole, because I think there's a real disconnect between evidence based stuff and people that kind of have really dedicated their life to studying all these different things and really know a lot about it. There's a big disconnect with that and sort of the mainstream conversation that happens around drugs and alcohol. So that's pretty cool. How are you, Nicole?
I'm great. Yeah.
How are
All
you
things
coping with the
considered.
COVID?
Well, yeah, pretty good. Pretty good. I've got a very tidy house at the moment.
Yep.
I've got loads of time to be organising things, and yeah,
Love
that's
it.
good.
So usually I do an introduction, but you've just done so many things and I don't 100% get the academic world as well. That's not the only thing that Nicole does, but just like in a snapshot, just tell us kind of about yourself and what you do, because you've written books and done lots of stuff.
Yeah, I've done lots of stuff. Nearly all of it's around alcohol and drugs,
Yep.
and a little bit around mental health and allied areas. My background's in psychology.
Yep.
So I started off as a psychologist, really as a research psychologist, and then I started doing some clinical work. So I see clients as well as research, and also do training with practitioners. And I have lots of hats, but the two main ones, I guess.
Heaps. Heaps.
The two main ones, I guess, I run a consultancy in the drug and alcohol sector called 360 Edge, which does professional development for practitioners around alcohol and drug topics. So alcohol and drug workers plus other health workers plus other frontline workers. And we also do what I call service development. So anything to do with service improvement, evaluation, program development, benchmarking, best practice, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And my other hat is as adjunct professor at the National Drug Research Institute. So that's just an honorary appointment and a connection with the university from all the research I've done.
Awesome. So a lot. And I guess a few things. I'm excited to talk to you about the service delivery stuff because that's I guess that's the area that I'm really interested in, but people are always kind of saying, oh, the system's fucked, the system's no good, all that kind of stuff. So I'd be interested to hear about that. But just like tell us quickly, why did you get interested in particularly like drugs and alcohol? Because traditionally it's something that most kind of people run away from,
I know, it's really, really interesting. And I've been thinking about that a lot
Yep.
lately. And at first for me, there's a combination of things. I guess that I have a very strong social justice drive.
Yep.
I don't understand why some people have millions of dollars and some people can't feed their families. I don't understand why people can't just accept other people as they are.
Yep.
And that all kind of feeds into stigma and all of that. And that's a really big part of the alcohol and drug sector. But when I started, that probably wasn't really my driver because I didn't understand all of that stuff at
Yep.
that time.
Yep.
I actually went to uni to do computing and computer science and started in engineering completely. And
That's funny.
accidentally fell into psychology because it was the only way I didn't have to repeat the whole of first year at uni. So it wasn't even a really deliberate kind of decision to make. And then I just got interested in from quite a research perspective or an intellectual perspective because that was in the 80s.
Yeah.
When we were still in that transition between confrontational punitive approaches and motivational interviewing was just starting to come into
Yep.
practice, and CBT had been around for a long time but hadn't been well applied to alcohol and drugs. So
Yeah.
I started kind of getting interested in that transition. That's how I really became part of the sector.
That is interesting because I guess we always talk about, and we've talked about a little bit on the show, how the alcohol and drug sector is always kind of a couple steps behind, or it feels like that anyway. Maybe we're not, but it feels like that we're always a couple of steps behind other healthcare industries or just other industries in general in terms of like technology and stuff like that. But it's funny you say that because a lot of the people that it would have been quite interesting space to come into in the 80s because a lot of the older guys that I know that are in recovery and all that kind of stuff that went to like rehabs, talk about having the therapeutic model was cleaning the floor with like toothbrushes or, like just stuff like that. Like it was this real kind of, as you said, punitive way of doing things.
Yeah. And it's, we know now that doesn't work, but at that time it was still the prevalent model that most rehabs were using.
Yeah.
There was some kind of moral deficiency in people who had problems with alcohol or drugs, and it needed to be kind of whipped out of them in some way, which I mean, now we know that's ridiculous, but that's what it was like then.
So the thing that I've got to ask you about, because I think it's something that I've found really polarizing is not the word, but it was very like different to how I thought, because I was quite kind of uneducated. I was just reading headlines at that stage, but something that you're kind of famous for, I guess, is like the stuff that you've done around ice, commonly known as the Ice Queen, and shining a light on the interesting research and the actual figures that exist around ice use and people developing problems with ice. Do you want to like tell us a little bit about all that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the things, like I think of myself as a pretty good researcher and a pretty good clinician, but I'm not like outstanding at I'm not the best that I know at either of those things. But what I'm really good at is like putting the two things together and seeing a bigger picture.
Yeah.
And so when, there was a whole bunch of researchers kind of looking at the data and a whole bunch of clinicians and also the community seeing what was happening on the ground, and those two things didn't really go together.
Yeah.
They didn't seem to go together. But when you look at all of the data and the bigger picture, you can see a pattern that, I could see a pattern that was pretty clear to me, that even though we were having a reduction in the number of people using methamphetamine, the type of methamphetamine people were using had switched from powder to ice, and so the harms were increasing. So it demonstrated, I think it demonstrated a bigger principle, that use is not the only indicator that we need to look at. It's actually harms that are really important.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess at that time as well, and it's something that now that we're sort of, it still gets brought up quite a bit, but we're out of that real intense phase of like the media reporting on ice as like this epidemic, like this kind of crazy thing. You'd almost think that was like back in 2015, 16, maybe earlier, something like that. You'd almost think it was kind of like how COVID-19's talked about in the news now. That was like what ice was like. It was just like plastered all over the TV and stuff like that. So, and I guess how people, don't get me wrong, the harm, as you said, the harms had obviously gone up, but it wasn't as bad as everybody thought, and people just weren't kind of walking around addicted. What was the like disconnect there, and what was the big thing that people were missing? It was around that people use ice, but they don't just necessarily get addicted straight away.
Well, yeah, and there's a whole load of myths that were generated because, you only see your part of the world that you see. You can only see if you're standing in a direction, you only see in front of you. You can't see behind you or to the side.
Yep.
So people making assumptions just looking ahead rather than looking 360. So it meant that I think that some well-intended people in the community and governments made some decisions that weren't really based on reality and what the data showed. 80% of people who use methamphetamine just use it occasionally, and most of those use it just once or twice a year.
Yeah.
And that kind of gets missed when you're in the emergency department, or you're in the drug and alcohol service, or you're in the community, and you can see it's very visible. You miss the bigger picture. So I think that's why it's really important for our responses to be informed by the evidence and by the data.
Yeah, because what was actually happening, and full disclosure, I was one of those people, so I was stuck in the bubble. I hadn't had extra kind of education. I wasn't talking to other people with different points of view at the time. I was working in a rehab. So all we were seeing was like the kind of 1% of people that are severely addicted and dependent. And I just thought, that coupled with the news, doing a lot of media myself, I just thought everybody was addicted to ice. And once I kind of snapped out of that and looked kind of over the hill, it was really interesting because there was a flow-on effect that actually happened where there was a larger group of people that weren't at the pointy end, that were at severe risk of kind of falling into that category, but weren't getting any help because they were feeling stigmatized, or they didn't feel comfortable to reach out because they didn't want to be labeled as like like an ice junkie or whatever. And that was a really interesting shift for me to have.
Yeah, and I think that there was a whole load of implications from that. I think that's really important, that where we actually might have had a bigger impact was that group in the middle who were using quite regularly and at risk of becoming dependent on it or having other problems, but so much stigma around it that they were like not having a bar of going into treatment. And also it meant that our policy decisions were not around harm reduction, they were around policing, because if we need to reduce use, then we need to reduce supply. And so all of the focus was on reducing supply rather than actually reducing harms.
Yeah.
So I think that it really demonstrates how important it is to look at the whole picture
Yeah.
and make decisions based on the whole picture and not just what appears to be the case.
Yeah. So tell me, right, so when we say the data, because it's something that I've noticed, and I agree that we have to be more evidence-based because we're not. But the other thing that I've noticed is kind of observing these circles is that, from my point of view anyway, like the evidence is also limiting, like in terms of how we collect it. And so how is, these prevalent measures and whether a service is effective? I know they're two different things, so sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, but all these different things, how is that actually calculated? And just like talk the listeners through the process on how that's actually determined, because I think a lot of people don't understand that, because I definitely didn't.
So at a kind of population level, or at a kind of bigger government level, we collect a whole load of data sets.
Yep.
So every 4 years, there's the National Drug Household Survey.
Yep.
And that's a random survey. It's about 25 to 30,000 people that are surveyed, and it's extrapolated to the general population.
Yep.
So all of the data has holes. There's no perfect data set. So that, for example, doesn't capture people in mental health facilities or homeless, or, so it's not capturing a larger proportion of people who are at risk. So the data is probably a slight underestimate in that case. But it'll be a slight underestimate every year that it's done. So we can look at trends at least. And then there's a whole range of other data sets collected. There's some what's called sentinel groups of drug users, people who use drugs, that are surveyed over and over again every year through the illicit drug reporting system and the ecstasy and related drug reporting system. And then there's the wastewater data as well. And then there's the treatment data. So the treatment data is how many people have come into treatment, what have they come in for, and what were their outcomes, like whether they left unexpectedly or whether they completed treatment or that kind of thing.
Do they look at like ambulance data as well?
Yeah, ambulance and hospital data is also part of the mix as well.
Yeah. So, and then is the process, and this is on like a wider population scale, the analysts, experts, how do they do it? Do they like amalgamate it together or look for trends that appear across all of it, or?
Well, yeah, that would be the ideal. But the way that research works is that people become specialised in their particular area.
Right.
And so they tend to just focus on one or two of the data sets and utilise that. But in an ideal world, we would put all of those data sets together and have a look at the pattern between them and come up with a better solution, I think, than just looking at one or the other.
Yeah. And so what's the latest group of data sets from a population health perspective? What's the latest that's come out with that? What year?
So probably the National Drug Household Survey was collected last year, and it will come out it should come out in the next couple of months.
Yeah.
And the wastewater data is collected frequently, every couple of months throughout the year.
So tell me about, because I was going to ask you, like, what are some of the trends that we're seeing? And I don't know if you know that off the top of your head, but what are some of the trends you're seeing? But also, like, tell us about the wastewater data, because I know that because that's that's controversial, because I know that's thrown in the news because it sounds kind of sexy that they're like sifting through our poo and like working out what we're doing or whatever, and they use that all the time in the news. But I know that amongst kind of researchers that it's contentious.
Yeah, and it's really it's a data set that's really easy to digest because it's more concrete than some of the other data that we have.
Yep.
But there's a huge problem in it. So the way that it's collected is that there's particular places around Australia where wastewater is sampled,
Yep.
and they.
So like, do they go to like Werribee and like take a scoop out of the poo farm or
something like that? Yeah, out of the sewage, the sewage wastewater. And when so that it's in the same spots each time. There's multiple spots around Australia.
Yep.
No one except the researchers and the government knows where the spots are.
Oh,
so they don't.
Conspiracy coming on.
They don't disclose which testing sites are where,
Right.
or how much, like what the drug rates were in different testing sites. And so the more testing sites we have, the better the data will be.
Yep.
So the problem with it is that it tests for metabolites of a range of drugs, which means that the drugs have been digested in order to be detected. So if you just chucked your pills down the toilet, it wouldn't detect those. It would only detect once it's been metabolized in your body, the outcomes of that. So one of the problems with it is that it can only tell us the volume of drugs that have been used, and not the prevalence of drugs. So it'll tell us that a certain number of kilos of drugs have been used in this particular area, but we don't know whether a few people have used a massive amount of drugs or a load of people have just used a little bit.
Yeah.
We can't tell that from that data, and we have to put it together with the other population data to make more sense of it.
Yeah. And does it, I don't know if anyone's done this, but does it spike around music festivals and events like that? Yeah.
It's very seasonal. So you can see in summer it's a lot higher than in winter. Yeah. And it is affected by things like people congregating to, a lot of the festivals are in regional areas. And so when people come into the regional area to go to the festival and they're there for 3 or 4 days, that might affect the amount of drugs in the wastewater, for example. But it doesn't, those people aren't there all the time. They might come from all over Australia. So it doesn't indicate that particular area is necessarily a hotspot.
Right. So, okay. So that makes sense. So really what is needed with the wastewater is that there needs to kind of be more transparency around the testing sites and where they're located so that there can be a greater number of people not disputing, but analyzing the data and just making sure that it's right. Is that kind of what people would want?
That would be one way to deal with it. I think the other way is to make sure that the researchers are taking account of the environment that the data is collected from. So if there is a festival, then you need to take account of that. And I think that the dissemination of that data has been problematic. So it's talked about as if it's a prevalence measure. And so we can tell that in a particular area, there's heaps and heaps of people using, but we actually don't know that. And it's talked about as if it's a perfect measure. And it's just as imperfect as the population data and the treatment data. It's also got holes in it. It's not a perfect data collection system, and it's not a perfect analysis system either.
Yeah, interesting. So tell me, what are the trends coming at that we've seen? So you said that the new household data is coming out in hopefully a couple of weeks or months or whenever it was, but so what were the trends that we're seeing before that with drug use?
So we have seen some interesting things, quite a big reduction in young people's drinking. So that's teenagers and young adults. significantly over the last 10 years. It's been continually declining. So fewer people drinking, and also the people who are drinking less,
Yeah.
which is interesting. And the people who are drinking more are kind of middle-aged women, particularly
Wow.
my cohort.
Yeah.
So there's been a bit of a switch in who's drinking and how much they're drinking.
Yeah.
There's been a flattening and a decrease in lots of illicit drugs as well, particularly among young people. They're despite what the media says, they're becoming less interested in taking illicit drugs.
Why is that? Why is that? Like with the drinking and the young people using drugs? Yeah. What is there any ideas into why that actually is? Like, because to me the campaigns seem to be very like punitive and things like that still.
Hit and miss, yeah, sure, yeah, I agree. The mass media campaigns are not that helpful and don't align with best practice generally. There's no one knows for sure, but there's a couple of theories, I guess, that there's potentially there's a bit of modelling for this generation because their parents are a little bit older than my generation. So my mum was in her early 20s when she had me, but I was in my 30s when I had my child. And in my 20s, I was still partying, but in my 30s, I'd kind of settled down by then. And so there's probably a bit less modelling of lots of drinking and drug taking.
That's interesting.
There's much better drug education in schools now than there was even 10 or 15 years ago. There's a lot more evidence-based programs. They're not nearly as widespread enough, but they're but where they are available, they are they seem to be having an impact. And the other theory is around the kind of ways people communicate now. So there's a lot more online kind of social connections. People tend to go out to pubs. We've seen a decline in the night economy, which is probably reflective of, not sure which way it goes, but it's somehow associated with the reduction in young people drinking. So there might be a whole range of things that are impacting. There might be other things as well that we haven't really covered.
I know for me, like something that's kind of become big is that not so much club sports. I think in the last few years there's been a shift in club sport culture around like drinking and stuff. But I think, I don't know, almost the wellness movement. Like there's a lot of like young people now that would, or they're really in touch with like what it is to be healthy holistically as a person and everything that kind of goes into that. And I think that's had a big impact as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot more people just, doing yoga and sports and a whole range of other things that are kind of incompatible with drinking and taking drugs. That if you want to be healthy, and then on the other hand, drinking heaps, then there's a disconnect there. So yeah, I agree that people are much more focused on their health and well-being now.
So from someone that's on the front line of the data, what would need to be changed in your opinion, or fixed or amended just to help it improve even more? And actually, I guess firstly, would you say that what we do at the moment with data is awesome, like on a scale of 1 to 10? And what do we need to improve to make it better?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. It's not awesome, but our data sets are, compared to the rest of the world, pretty good. Like we have a lot of data collected, and it's collected quite rigorously. And if we, compared to some other countries, like New Zealand doesn't have a drug survey that's regular. I think the last data about the population level of drug use was, I don't know, something like 10 years ago.
Oh, that's amazing. We're beating them at something.
So, and there's lots of other countries that don't have ours is really regular every 4 years. And so we can see trends over time. and we have a lot of different data sets. I think the thing that's missing is putting all those data sets together into a story.
Yep.
That rarely happens. And it means that we could be making policy decisions in a bit of a vacuum.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. And I think that's, don't get me wrong, we can always be better. And I hate sort of saying this sometimes, but it's really true. Like, people have to remember as well, with whether it's drugs and alcohol, whether it's any healthcare system that we have in Australia, I wouldn't go out on a limb because I don't know and say that we're the best, but we have a pretty good, from what I've seen anyway, we have a pretty good healthcare system and a pretty good way of doing things. And it's just, even though to me it's frustrating and it feels like we're behind with a lot of stuff, we are, compared to the rest of the world, in front. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but yeah. And there is at least some kind of avenues for people to get help. So tell me, transitioning into that, your core business at the moment with 360 Edge is, as we were talking about at the start, service delivery improvement, workforce capacity building, things like that. How are we going with services? Because I know this is a big one for people. They feel like the system's fucked. And at times I feel like it's fucked, but is it really?
Yeah, it's really complex. I think that we've got a workforce, for example, that I think because as you said at the beginning, the sector is not one that people generally kind of scrambling to be in. You have to really be committed in some way to the sector to be in it. And so that is a really good start, that we've got a bunch of people who really care about the sector and the people who they're serving. I think the main problem is the lack of funding for alcohol and drugs, because it's seen by governments as a kind of low priority in some ways. I think there's just not enough money going into it to pay people well enough to lift the
standard.
The standard of services. So we still have a lot of people without any professional qualifications, for example. And you would not see that in any other health field. And I think that you know very well, Jack, that the peer workforce is really important, but that's a separate issue to the professional workforce. If you look at the professional workforce in other health areas, they're more professionalised than that. And I think a lot of that's not a function of not caring about that. It's a function of not being able to pay people at the level of a professional. So if I were to work in mental health, for example, as a psychologist, or in a hospital as a psychologist, I would be paid a lot more than if I was in an alcohol, as an alcohol and drug worker, for example.
100%. And it's, so you were saying at the start, you just don't understand how, people can't accept people for who they are, and some people have all the money and others don't, and all that stuff. One of the things I just cannot wrap my head around is just it's not like we're banging on, we just want money and funding for all these services and all this stuff. It's really just to pay people for
for the work that they do.
For the work that they do, and the extreme complexity and emotional volatility and all this stuff that they have to deal with on a daily basis, to walk home with like a good wage, which is probably when you're hitting into a manager of $80,000. It's just not, it's just not a lot. Exactly. Like, I don't know if you know what the averages are, but just off the top of my head, I think probably the averages in the alcohol and drugs sector would be maybe like 65,000.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was around that, which is not a lot.
And when I say that, I mean full-time working with people with incredibly complex needs and issues, not just with drugs and alcohol, in other areas of health, and with other like social issues and stuff. So it's, I 100% agree with you, and that's not putting down anyone that's listening to this that is working in the drug and alcohol sector. I think it's amazing what people do, but yeah, it's incredibly hard for people to get paid with what they're worth and be incentivized to actually get better, do better, upskill themselves. Yeah.
And we also lose a lot of good people out of the sector because they can
100%.
be paid better elsewhere. So we want to keep people who are specialists in alcohol and drugs in alcohol and drugs, because they're the ones that know about behaviour change and know about how to treat people. We don't want to lose them.
100%. He was my worker, and he was like one of the biggest reasons why I hung around in the service that I went to. I'm going to try and do another interview with him, because now that we've got the good equipment and the podcast and stuff. But he was saying to me that he was really disappointed, but he worked in the alcohol and drug space for like nearly 8 years, and he was awesome. Helped a lot of people, was really good, kind of progressed as much as he could through the ranks. But he just said to me, I left and started my own business, as like he's into motorbikes, and he's got like some kind of concreting business as well, because there was just like, even though everyone was really nice, loved what he was doing, there was just no opportunity for him to progress any further than he did. Which is crazy.
One thing that's really missing from the sector is professional pathways through the sector. So you kind of come in as a drug and alcohol worker, there might be a range of salary you can be on. You might kind of go up to that salary, but then to go to the next point, you need to take on a managerial job or do something else.
That's right.
There's fewer of those jobs. We need to be paying our good drug and alcohol workers more, so that they have time for professional development, they have time for supervision, they can provide supervision and mentoring to other people, and we don't lose them from the sector.
100%. And it's not like you're just going to be throwing money away either. It's going to be a positive ROI, because you're actually going to get better outcomes with service results as well.
Absolutely.
Because people are going to have more time, more specialized knowledge, which for everyone listening is exactly what you need, because that's the other crazy thing. If you think about drugs and alcohol, however you want to think about it, it's really a super specialized area of health. You need to spend some time understanding how it all happens physiologically, emotionally. There's lots of different components that make up a drug and alcohol issue. And so anyway, I feel like I'm banging on like a broken record.
But I agree. It's not like, not to kind of denigrate any other areas of health, but it's not like a broken arm where there's a protocol to fix it. We know what to do with a broken arm, different types of breaks. We know what the different ways to fix them. When you've got someone with a complex drug problem in front of you, they're all completely different. They've all come from a different background. They've got different pressures on them at the moment. They've had different pressures kind of in the development of the problem. And so you've got to be a pretty complex thinker to help them solve that problem that they've got.
So that's interesting. And that kind of helps transition into the next question that I had for you, which was, I don't know if you think it's a problem or something that we need to change, but one of the things that I've noticed as well is that, we don't have any protocols in terms of treating drug and alcohol use. Because for everyone listening, right, I guess there's two streams, and we only ever think about drug and alcohol use as addiction, which is one stream, which is like when you hit the pointy end. And then the other stream is just using drugs, and you might not actually have an addiction, but you're starting to have, maybe the person's starting to have issues with relationships or other problems, and they want to do something about it. And that's the first thing. People often don't understand the difference between that. But say if we're just talking addiction, right? There doesn't seem to be any protocols or standard markers to be measured against or hit that makes up, I guess you could call it like a clinical diagnosis or a agreed upon methodology of treating addiction. Is that true? That's what I think. Is that true, or is that not true?
Yeah, no, that's a pretty good summary of where we're at. There are protocols, but not everybody uses the same protocol. Some of them, some of the strategies that are being used are well outside what we would consider to be best practice. They might have been, 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, what, the best that we had, but technology has kind of moved along a lot since then. And research has moved a lot since then. So getting the practitioners to use what's current best practice is probably one of the most difficult things to transition into. And we know that it takes about 10 years from evidence to come out to get it into practice. So that's way too long.
Wow. So what is that best practice at the moment? Like, what's considered best practice?
So there's a range of different types of treatment that are effective. The mainstays in counselling are motivational interviewing. That's got a good evidence base now. We know that it is effective in motivating people to change. Behavioural and cognitive therapies. So there's a whole range of those that are effective. So traditional kind of what people call CBT, but is really cognitive therapy. But also some of the newer things like dialectical behaviour therapy, which started out for people with personality disorders. We know that works.
What's that?
So it's like a combination of Zen Buddhism and cognitive behaviour therapy principles.
Awesome.
So a lot of kind of acceptance and distress tolerance is one of the really key strategies.
Is that what they call acceptance and commitment therapies, or is that something different?
Yeah, that's something different as well. And that's that's very new, much newer, and it's got a smaller evidence base, but there's some indication that that's also effective as well. So that's also based on behavioural and cognitive principles, actually on what's called radical behaviourism, so reinforcement.
So just to go back and explain, because I often forget that maybe people are listening and they don't know the alphabet soup that we're talking about. So what's Cbt Brief Definition?
So it stands for cognitive behaviour therapy. And it's the idea behind it is that there's two things: that we view the world through a particular lens that we have developed right across our childhood and into adulthood, that is unique to us. And it's not the situation that might be the problem, it's the way we view the situation. So if we can change the way we think about something, then we can shift how we feel about it. As well. And some of that is changing the way we respond to a situation. So that's where the behaviour comes in.
So, and the way that it kind of plays out for people in a session, if you think about it, so now people are going to be going to their psychologist and thinking, oh, they're doing CBT with me, or is this acceptance and commitment? The way it kind of plays out from my understanding is that you help someone to kind of realize the thought process that's going on versus the action that's happening, and help them to identify maybe what they could do different. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a pretty good description. So we know that the idea is that thoughts and behaviours and feelings are all kind of linked in this circle. And if you behave differently, it'll impact on your thinking and it'll impact on how you feel. If you think slightly differently about something, it'll impact on how you respond to it, your behaviour and how you feel. And so the idea of cognitive behavior therapy is to try and impact on your thinking and your behavior. So things like if you feel really stressed and you always reach for a drink when you feel stressed, if you take a few breaths first and calm down, you might not need the drink. And that's just a really simple behavior that shifts how you think about whether you need a drink or not.
Yeah, 100%. Awesome. So that's CBT. What about motivational interviewing? What's that one?
So it's kind of a bit out as it sounds. It's also called motivational enhancement therapy.
Yeah. So it's not called, is it not called motivational interviewing anymore?
Yeah, it is.
It is. Okay.
It's kind of the manualized version is called motivational enhancement therapy. Okay. The process is called motivational interviewing.
I like motivational enhancement therapy better, actually, because I remember when I learned about motivational interviewing, I thought that's a weird name. Like, you're not interviewing someone, you know?
It is. It sounds like you're kind of, you're doing some kind of media interview with them and ticking off stuff, but it's completely the opposite to that. So it's the idea is that, as I said before, you can only see what's in front of you and not behind you. And motivational interviewing is the idea is to ask lots of what are called Socratic questions. So open-ended questions that help someone to reflect on the situation so that they can see the whole picture around them. So often when people have problems with alcohol and drugs, they tend to focus on either what's really great about using and they minimize some of the problems. And when those two things are tipped up, when you start recognizing some of the problems and how deeply they might be affecting you, then the theory is that creates a shift in your thinking and then a shift in your behavior as well.
Yeah, 100%. And both of those things are really important, obviously, when you're going, for anyone listening that's currently in some sort of state of addiction or has been before or whatever. It's obviously really important because, extended drug and alcohol use impacts on kind of your perception about yourself and the rest of the world. So having someone help you to illuminate what might be really going on without telling you is really helpful. So explain, what's acceptance and commitment therapy like? How does that work?
So that's a form of behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy.
Yeah.
It's not a different therapy. It's come out of the same kind of approach and the same kind of theory.
Yeah.
The difference is that it incorporates a lot of mindfulness and acceptance and reflection. So that's where the acceptance comes from in the name of it. Reflection, mindful reflection and acceptance of the situation, rather than some of the traditional CBT strategies are much more about arguing with yourself and coming up with a counter argument and that kind of thing. So acceptance and commitment therapy say, don't worry about any of that. Just accept that this is the situation that you're in and move forward from there.
Got it.
And it also focuses, one of the features which is very similar to motivational interviewing is that it focuses on how your values and maybe how your forgotten values can drive change. So if you remember why you want to be a really good father, then that might have an impact on whether you're drinking in front of your kids, for example.
100%. And then you were saying, what's the new like Buddhist one called again? What did you call it?
Dialectical behavior therapy.
Dialectical behavior therapy. So, and then how does that work? Is that kind of the same, where it has some of those old principles with some cool Buddhist stuff in there?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's a combination of Zen Buddhism and acceptance and understanding and cognitive behavior therapy.
Yeah. So I guess the question is so that's like kind of the talkative side of things. Is there anything like revolutionary? Because I guess a lot of the people these days, you know, they have access to the internet. There's people like Joe Rogan talking on there. There's lots of different stuff out there, which is awesome. There's even people like Professor, well, I forget his first name, but I always remember his last name, Nutt. David, is it David?
David Nutt.
Yeah.
David Nutt, yeah.
Nutty. Hazelnut, I call him. But yeah, so there's people like that out there kind of talking about, the use of psychedelics to help with initial kind of drug use recovery. There's like lots of different stuff out there. There's been like 12-step fellowships with like spirituality stuff involved. There's like, people go down avenues of religion. There's lots of stuff out there. I can't even think of all the different things that people do. So that's kind of the evidence-based, what we talked about before with the different talkative therapies. Is there anything else that's kind of coming up that makes real sense that really kind of helps people? I know that's a big question. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a big question. There's nothing really revolutionary that I can see. I mean, I think that my view is that we have all the pieces, and we can always know more, of course, but we have all the pieces to improve what we do already. It's just a matter of actually using them.
Yeah.
So things like I think because of the stigma around alcohol and drugs, we really, as a society, quite resistant to harm reduction measures. When those things from the data, if we just looked at the data, they would be hugely impactful in terms of reducing harms, obviously.
Yeah.
So I think that and we've got some good treatments that we know work, but getting them implemented is the difficult thing. So I think that the implementation of the stuff that we know works is probably the key for us moving forward.
Yeah.
Really.
So for people out there, if they're looking to get help, they're looking at a service, what should they be looking for as a quality service? Because it's not clear, I would say, for people, so if I'm to go to the doctor for, I don't know, let's say, a broken arm, I kind of know like what I'm looking for. I know that not only do I need a GP, I need someone that has kind of a proven track record, has some stuff behind them, presents it well, can explain the situation to me, is recommended by someone else. I don't know. Like, it's not clear like that for drugs and alcohol, I've found.
Yeah, it's definitely not clear. And there's so many services that are kind of doing their own thing and making it sound like it's innovative and new, and because everyone thinks the system's fucked, which it's not, they are looking for something new that'll fix it. And in fact, we don't need that. I don't think we need that. And it is a problem because the sector's really, as you know, is unregulated. And so there's a lot of private providers, not that I know a lot of private providers that are providing excellent service, but it does leaves it open for dodgy people to come in and say, I've got this new, brand new tough love therapy and and it works, 100% without actually even measuring whether it's working or not.
100%. And that's the interesting thing. So just to kind of touch on that for everyone, it's really important. You can go to my website, or there's some other stuff. I've started to put together like some documents for people just to kind of ask a bit more like probing questions to providers so that they can make sure that they're getting a good service. Because this is not a war against private providers, because I think you've had a private practice in the past, Nicole. I've got a private service. you know, like they're great, like private stuff is good, but as long as it's done within the bounds of what is evidence-based and acceptable, because unfortunately, like Nicole said, there really is some dodgy kind of providers out there. And if you're not careful, you could think that because you're paying 50,000 or whatever it is, that you're going to get an awesome service. And really you're not, like, you're getting a service that's not even as good as kind of the worst run public service or whatever. I don't know. But so that's important that people know that. So what should people be looking for in, let's keep it kind of brief, in like a rehab or an outpatient rehab program? What should they be looking for?
Well, so they should be, you should go visit for a start if you're looking at a rehab to see whether you like the feel of it, right?
Yes.
And people's intuition about whether something is good or dodgy, I think, is generally pretty good. So that would be the first thing for me.
100%.
But you'd be wanting to ask them about things like what kinds of treatments do they provide, and make sure that they say things like, we use motivational interviewing, cognitive behavior therapy, or ACT, or DBT, or one of the therapies that we know are effective.
Yep.
You'd want to see that those interventions are the core of the program, not a side thing. So a lot of programs started off, and I think most of the mainstream ones have moved now, but as you said, they started off with, you know, if you did work around a farm, that was kind of treatment, but that isn't treatment. That's an important adjunct to treatment, but it won't fix your drug and alcohol problem without some deliberate intervention. I'd be asking them about their family involvement, because we know that involvement of families at an appropriate level and appropriate time for some people. Some people's families are not helpful, but most people's would be supportive. So if they have a kind of family program, that's a good sign. If they have some kind of peer program, that's a really good sign. I think if they, the things that concern me and distress me are hearing things like, if you break a rule, then you just get kicked out. Like, you ask about discharge and, you know, completion of program and that kind of thing. Because it's highly likely that someone going through either an inpatient or outpatient program, a live-in or a live-out program, the process of addiction or dependence is a kind of cycling one. So people will slip up as you go along. And if you take that punitive approach, it's unhelpful.
Yeah. And I think, you know, with the rehab stuff, the thing that becomes challenging for inpatient rehabs, and I'm just thinking back to when, you know, I was managing one and whatever, is because they are that therapeutic community, is how you manage someone's individual slip up if that happens during the program, and how that will impact on the whole community and the attitude that kind of filters in and all that stuff. But you can do it. There is ways to do it, and you shouldn't just be completely exited from a program. That definitely is something that is not helpful overall. There's definitely ways of doing it that you can be, you know, help to understand your behavior, but not kick to the curb.
That's just not, even just from a duty of care perspective, that's not good. And even if you do need to exit the program, if that's the consensus, then there needs to be a link to some other kind of treatment service. So if you're in a rehab and you're not really suited to the rehab, then you should be offered day rehabilitation or an outpatient counselling program. So we're thinking about stepping up and stepping down treatment depending on what's appropriate for the person at the time.
100%. So the other thing that I wanted to ask you, just before we start getting towards the end, and I think I know your answer to this, and it's like similar to mine. Talking about rehab, like, do people actually need to go? You know, from all your experience in this sector, and I know it's hard to kind of say on the masses because it's individualized, but yeah, do people really need to go away for 3 months to 6 months to 12 months in some cases to get recovery?
Most people don't, and rehab is a really good option for someone who has tried lots of other different types of treatment and it hasn't worked for them. Or they don't have a very good home environment where they need to be away from it to for treatment to be effective. So either they're homeless or they're living with a whole bunch of people who are still using, or they're in a situation, I don't know, with domestic violence, or a very chaotic situation, or their dealer lives next door. Those kinds of things are really unhelpful in people trying to get better. So if that's the case, then being away in a facility could be quite helpful.
Yeah.
But most people don't need that. Most people can get the level of intensity of treatment that they need through other means, through non-live-in types of treatment.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. And people really misunderstand me when I say this, is that, it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but in the same kind of sentence is that, like, largely people don't need to go to rehab. There is, for all the reasons that Nicole said, there is the reasons where people do need to go to rehab, and that's great, right? And those services need to be there. But at the moment, we're probably too far on the end of like, if you say that I have an addiction or a drug and alcohol problem or whatever it is, that boom, just go to rehab. When actually, from what I know about recovery and my own personal experience of, because that's what recovery actually is. It's not about just being clean and sober and thinking about it in that way. It's about having a better life and feeling happier about yourself and all that stuff. Going to rehab for a lot of people is actually the exact opposite to what is needed for them, which is like some structure, routine, a sense of purpose, and enjoyment by like going to work and being around family. A chance to kind of implement things into their everyday life. And it is kind of a crazy thing that we have, is that, that if you have a problem, just go away for 3 months, just remove yourself from society. Yeah. It's really strange.
Yeah. And then you come back to exactly the same situation that you left without any skills to deal with it, because you've been away in a completely different environment.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing about rehab is that it's not for everybody. It doesn't suit everybody. If you think about, you need some level of skill to participate in residential rehab. You're living with, 10 to 100 other people who you don't know, who you might not like, a lot of them, who are also going through a difficult emotional time, and you're going through a difficult emotional time.
Yeah.
And you are asked to do very structured things the whole day. You've got to help cook, you've got to help clean, you've got to help do a whole range of other things. And not everybody's ready for that level of intensity, notwithstanding their drug and alcohol problem. And people who are quite dependent do just as well in day rehabilitation, where they can go home, or counselling, outpatient counselling, where they just go once or twice a week, or even more frequently.
Yeah. So tell me, like, just to, like, because I'm just thinking as we're talking about all this, because this is something that often happens, is that someone's sitting here listening to this podcast or watching this YouTube video, and they're thinking, and I don't mean to offend you here, but that's all well and good, Nicole, you fucking academic or whatever, like, and
ivory tower.
that's all good, Jack. Like, you've come out the other side and you've got a great life and all that, but I'm sitting here, I'm struggling, I really want help, I'm on an assessment waiting list, for 3 weeks or whatever, because that's what happens, or I want to go to detox, but I have to wait 5 weeks or whatever. Like what do you actually like say to people? Like what can they do, particularly now in these COVID times? Because I think that's the thing that people need to understand. We're not saying that the system's great and perfect. But yeah, like what do you say to those people, or what can people do just to get some kind of support for where they're at if they're in that situation?
So there's lots of different ways to access treatment and support, right from what we call bibliotherapy, which is just, reading some stuff and doing your own thing. Actually, most people who have a problem with alcohol or drugs sort it out themselves.
Yep.
And they're probably the people who don't have a trauma background and haven't been using for a very long time and don't have a complex family situation, for example.
Yep.
So that's a good place to start, all the way up to residential rehab. But there are things like I'm on the board of Hello Sunday Morning.
Yep.
Which is
it's awesome.
It has an app that you can join a community. I think there's something like 100,000 people have used it, and you can just chat with other people and get support, peer support from other people through this app. There's lots of other online communities. You can, if you can afford to, you could go to a private psychologist or nurse or social worker. You also need to remember that there's long waiting lists for residential rehab, but there isn't long waiting lists for counselling. So that's always an option. Even if you think ultimately you need residential rehab, something is better than nothing. One of my favourite sayings is, don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah.
Anything that you can do, even if it's really small, that makes you feel better or more supported, you should do it. Don't wait for the perfect solution.
Yeah.
And there's not one size fits all. So try a few things. Not everything will work. You might try one thing, it doesn't make much difference. Try something else. But there's a lot of things that you can try.
Yeah, 100%. And that's what I say to people as well. Like, when we talk about the system more broadly and we talk about some of the good things and the different stuff that you can do, like I just always have to, I think the word is caveat it with that whole notion is that, we understand that largely there is some parts of the system that are tough, like when you really want help and you have to wait and all those kinds of things. But one thing that, I'm always pushing for is the drug and alcohol sector, in terms of the public side of things, needs to have a better promotion arm and maybe consolidate its efforts to promote, because as Nicole said, there's actually now, they may not be the end result of what you need, but there is lots of stuff that you can kind of fill up in between, whether it just be going on to things like Facebook and just typing in addiction group. And there's like loads of support groups that you can jump on and at least kind of talk to people. There's things like Hello Sunday Morning. They're great. There's lots of cool kind of internet things coming out now, which is cool.
And there's a whole range of, as you know, Jack, I'm not a huge fan of AA. There's a disconnect for me with the philosophy, but as a support group, it's everywhere and it's very, very accessible. And I can see that some of the support groups have gone online now. And also Smart Recovery is a more kind of CBT oriented version, not nearly as widespread, but also online now. So there are lots of things much more accessible than they used to be.
100%. So just for everyone listening, like we get it that sometimes it can be tough, but if you do get into that space where you're waiting, just try and fill up your kind of support network or recovery capital, as they call it these days, with as much kind of stuff as you can, because it really helps. So just to finish up, the little, what are they called? Leprechaun over the rainbow pot of gold question. Like so actually just before, do you know off the top of your head, because so for everyone listening, funding of public drug and alcohol services and all healthcare services is split up into federal government funding and state government funding. So Nicole, do you know, because people are listening all around Australia and I think it varies between states, but states have the bulk of drug and alcohol funding, is that right?
That's correct.
Is there a set number or they make it up themselves?
They make it up.
Yeah. Okay.
They make it up as they go along. And it depends on which state you're in, what the size and the type of treatments that are available.
Yeah. So you're in Victoria, roughly. I am too. Roughly, what's the state government funding for drug and alcohol services in Victoria?
I know that. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's probably about 10 times the size of the federal funding.
Yeah. What's the federal? Do you know the federal funding?
Nope.
Okay. No, that's all right. I was trying to think of it the other day. I don't even want to have a pot shot at it because I'll get it wrong. But anyway, so if I gave you all the, let's say, the state funding, and you had to because it is kind of somewhat substantial. Like, what would you do with it? How would you fix the system or make it better, or whatever?
I'd probably, this is going to sound a bit controversial, but I'd probably actually reduce the size of the services and increase the quality of them.
Yeah.
So even if that might mean fewer people being seen, I think ultimately it will mean fewer people bouncing back and having to be seen multiple times if we can improve the quality of the implementation of the science.
Yeah.
So that'd be like the implementation of the science is the really critical thing for me. I think that we know enough about what works. It's actually getting it into practice and getting it consistently into practice that's the bigger problem. And I think the other thing for me is enhancing accessibility, and I think technology is the thing that's going to do that. So,
boom. Hey, I'm with you there.
So I think that's really, if we can put more thinking into how that works, I think we'll do a lot better, especially with, as you said, that kind of middle group. We could do a lot of secondary prevention where they don't go on to get worse problems, and we don't have to see them in the drug and alcohol system.
That's right. I 100% agree with you. Like, if it was me, I would almost probably do the same thing as you. Like, I wouldn't say that I would reduce. It would just be structured a lot differently, and there'd be more of a front-end load on really quality telehealth and online services to capture people where they're at and where they're actually accessing information and services. And you do that stuff where you capture that group that you talked about, you prevent them from hitting worse problems because you get them earlier. And you'd also be able to support people a lot more that did need those pointy end services, and then make those pointy end services 100 times better. Anyway, don't get me started. I don't know why we can't just do this stuff. Just give me the money and let me do it.
We should just run the world, Jack.
That's right. That's right. Hey, well, thanks, mate. Thanks for coming on. If people are listening and they want to know more about what you do, so Nicole does, so there's a couple of things that you can probably access straight away. She does heaps of stuff with frontline, or her company, I should say, does heaps of stuff with frontline workers at 360 Edge, but also, like, where can people find you to, do you do direct client stuff as well? Oh,
sorry, I missed that.
Have we frozen? Do you do direct client work as well, or is it just more professional stuff at the moment?
The main thing that my company does, my organisation does, is works with services and governments and policy and practice. But I do. I just have a very small client load. I don't see many clients, but just a couple at a time.
All good. So if people want to know more, Nicole's company is 360 Edge. Where's the best place to find you?
360edge.com.au is probably the first port of call.
Yep. Awesome. No worries. Done. Hey, thanks for coming on, mate. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Hey YouTube watcher, thanks for watching this video and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you and your family are doing well in these extraordinary times. I also want to ask you, can you please subscribe and hit the bell notification? We're really launching into our YouTube channel this year and want to build our audience so that we can progress through the ranks and basically get the message of recovery and hope and change and all that good stuff out there to as many people as we can. So we would love it if you would consider it and subscribe and help us out. Also, for anyone seeking help and information and resources, we've put together a 100% free online course that you can access, link in the description. So if you are looking for help, hope that is something that can help you out as well. Until next time, see you in the next video. Peace.